that the money circulates out of Angolan economy and it goes not to some dodgy tax haven in the Caribbean. It goes to high street banks in places like the UK, Portugal, France. It's very much part of a globalized story of money laundering, of capital flight, but most importantly in terms of the elite. Angolan elites have exactly the same aspirations, and they model themselves very much on their global counterparts. The same way that Russian elites in the 1990s looked very exotic, but suddenly they started sending their kids to Eton. They decided that they wanted to go to Ascot, that they wanted to have a Miami mansion, that they decided to build a big art collection. That's exactly what the Angolans are doing. It's what side's striking, and I think if you read the book, maybe you'll get to a different perspective, but what I try to say is not that this is an exotic elite, it's just how conventional their aspirations are. They want to be like the rest of the 1%. They want to have jets, they want to have a European Union passport, many of them already have a Portuguese passport. They want to have a life modeled exactly on what they're seeing the global elite to have. And I think in that regard, I would underline, far from their otherness, I would invite just how conventional their aspirations are, right? They're not different, they're the same. And in that regard, I think there's a section in chapter 4 in which I compare this phenomenon of elite building in Angola since the end of the Cold War with the equivalent in Russia. Both Russia and Angola are post-socialist societies that went through a period of wild capitalism, which in none of these societies has been debated. We're still in it. So I think the comparisons are very, very strong. And certainly, obviously the book is about Angola. It's not a comparative study of African elites, but it actually does a lot of work in trying to put this into context. And also I would emphasize that a lot of the elite culture in Angola, their restaurants, their beauty parlors, everything that surrounds the material life of the elite is being curated by Brazilians, Portuguese, Americans, British, Italians, luxury service providers. So I think, like elites in most places, they want Ferrari, they want Louis Vuitton, they want a Learjet. It's very, very conventional. I want to emphasize that if that didn't come across, I certainly tried to show it. The other point I want to emphasize is that globalness of the story. And I tried to underline just how implicated not just Western banks are, I mentioned capital flight and money laundering, but also the big management consultancies from the West, which are now running important chunks of Angolan public policy, the big five, or the big four now. But many corporations are deeply implicated. They're part of this project of governance that I tried to highlight. So it's a very cosmopolitan story, which is not unique. It's uniquely Angolan in terms of outcomes, but it's created out of a global hodgepodge of influences, and not just sourced through exclusively or primarily Angolan roots. The second point is the point about functioning through foreigners. I meant this very factually, Lara. Angola, because it was a settler society where Africans were not given opportunities to the extent that they were given in other non-settler societies. Even working class jobs in the early 70s were mostly performed by whites. When the Portuguese left in 74, 75, there were about 80 university graduates left in the country, right? And as you know, from 75, 76 until the end of the Cold War, Eastern European, Eastern Bloc workers, but especially Cubans, they kept the health service, the educational sector, and a lot of arms of the government alive. For instance, Sonangol was initially managed through Arthur D. Little, an American consulting company. I'm merely saying that at the level of the human personnel that runs the Angolan state and the Angolan economy, for instance, now the banking sector. 10 years ago, Angola barely had a banking sector. Now it's the third largest in Africa. But if you see behind the scenes, there's a lot of expats. When I say that they are absolutely essential to keep the economy working, I mean to keep the economy working according to the parameters which the elite has defined for the economy. I'm not saying they're indispensable, I'm not saying they're good, and I'm certainly not saying that they're performing a civic-spirited developmental role. And I think there's a plenty of development, there are plenty of ironies and plenty of stories in which you can show, the book shows that a lot of expats are there. There are many honest people who are doing a good job, and I don't like it when people are sort of vilified wholesale, but many expats are there to profit from the boom economy and really couldn't care less about it, right? And certainly, whatever the expats do, they do it according to Angolan defined parameters. So if the government wants them to perform positive roles, they do, but oftentimes, as for instance some Vietnamese doctors in Moshiko and in Lunda Sul are performing. Very often, however, these expats are a constitutive element in the governance of Angola from a non-developmental perspective. But again, I was certainly not saying that these expats are somehow responsible for everyday life amongst the poorest in Angola, and who are literally not, mostly they're just making ends meet without any involvement of the state whatsoever, certainly very little positive involvement. The question about modernity, I'll skip for a second. I think that the point about modernity is essentially visual modernity, having to do with emulating the built environments of societies that are deemed modern by the elite. But it also has to do with a particular project which goes back to the Unity-MPLA divide and a much, much older understanding of what Angola should be, whether Angola should be a Creole, Portuguese-speaking, cosmopolitan, urban, Atlantic society, or whether it should be a more African hinterland society. Again, I'm presenting this in a very simplistic way, but at some basic level, this really did preside over competing political projects in Angola. And I do think that in that regard, I would emphasize the Angolan specificity. Not the Angolan uniqueness. Those of you who know Ethiopia in the imperial period, you know that the Amharic core of the state thought in a very, very, very pejorative way about the periphery. And certainly in the case of Khartoum, the government of Sudan nowadays, there is an implicit standard to civilization in the perception that the regime have about peripheral, not properly Arabized society. And I think in the case of Angola, we're looking about a society that has an implicit standard of civilization, in which some people are deemed more Angolan because they're more Europeanized, because they behave with certain mannerisms, and other people are seen like Malta da Selva, Matuns, whatever expression you want to find. And I think that is very central to the state building project in Angola, and it builds into it patterns of exclusion that are deeply problematic for Angola. The 2 points that Chris raised, war made a state and make it. That's a concern that people in Sonangol have. A lot of people, Sonangol, for those of you who don't know, it's probably the second largest company in Africa and the biggest company in sub-Saharan Africa. Its profits rival Coca-Cola and a lot of every year. It's the entity that makes Angola go loud. And in that regard, Sonangol, even during the communist period, was isolated from communist economics and from socialist management. And it was a hyper-pragmatic and fairly competent, I would say very competent entity, which was there at the service of the state. But it was isolated from the rest of Angola's political economy, which was more typically corrupt and inefficient, etc., etc. That was the reason for its success. Now, at the end of the war, when I was doing some of my first research there, some Angolans in Sonangol asked, is it Angola that will be Sonangolanized, or is it the company that is going to be Angolanized? I mean, who's going to take over who? And what we've seen in the last few years is a breaking down of that barrier between the company and Angola's society and economy as the presidency pushes Sonangol to play roles that are deeply political and not very, very, very good for the company. So a lot of Sonangol people were particularly annoyed at having to run the industrialization of Angola, which is a big failure as far as zone economic special, which is being run by Sonangol, and people in Sonangol don't want it because they know it's a white elephant, it's not going to go anywhere. And also Kulamba, the big showcase urban development outside Rwanda, has also been taken over by the national company because the president told them to, and it's not going well either. So I would say that the gains that the Angolan state made during the war may prove practical, but it may come as the war sort of recedes into the past. Some of these gains may recede as well. And finally, to the question that you asked about the spending pattern. I think that, again, 400, I didn't mention this number, but it's an interesting number. From 2003 until 2013, Angola received $467 billion in oil revenues. It's a lot of money, okay? So from that perspective, what strikes one is just how scarce and disappointing and socially narrow the beneficiaries of Reconstruction have been. And it really does break down, according to this pattern that Richard hinted at, an urban versus, a pattern of urban investment versus rural. That doesn't mean that the cities have been heavily invested on, because when we talk about the cities, it's the cement city. It's the European showcase of modernity. With, for instance, most Musech, the shanty towns in Rwanda where most of the population of some 6.5 million Rwandans live. Those shanty towns don't have electricity, don't have water. When the rainy season comes, it's a massive problem. They're malaria-ridden. So even there's an outer frontier within the urban setting that is being excluded. So the record is indeed very, very disappointing. And on that sour note, we'll open the floor. Again, there are topics that I just merely hinted at, because I didn't want to summarize the whole book for you, but I'm sure that there's enough there to get a conversation going.
We'll take questions in, we'll take them in threes. Please give your name in mind. Yeah?
Amanullah Khan.
Sorry?
Amanullah Khan.
Yeah.
It's an honor to be listening to very eminent professors. My question is very simple. No one knows better than you the war, the new modern phenomenon of nexus with China, the globalization, and the urges of the Angolan people for Angolization. My question is very simple. What is the fate of the ordinary Angolan, which you have symbolized by referring to the shanties in the next 100 centuries? Because the treasures of that country have come to the surface, and they've been watched by the satellites from all over the world. And I don't want to say anything against China, but anybody coming from outside, that glory or that spurt in energy may be a 9-day wonder. What about the process and phenomenon? Is there any mechanism, politically and economically, to build a process of self-executing and self-perpetuating mechanism for the real Angolan people? Are they still in chains, or they are living just as the civil rights leader said, I have a dream?
Okay.
That's
Thank
my
you.
question.
Right. Another question. Yes, here at the front.
My name is Mario Mateo. Because you just mentioned about 400 billion from
467.
460 from second agriculture. Was it in cash or was it exchange with the contract in China? Because they do a contract with China to build the infrastructure. It is included on this one?
Okay, yes, question. Actually, can I go further towards the back? Yes, please. Yeah. Is there there isn't a roving mic, so I'll repeat the question. Yeah.
Lilian One from Coventry.
Sorry, what's your name?
Lilian One.
Oh, yeah.
I just wonder where does the know-how or forms of capacity come into the whole picture, because we tend to forget that it's only been 13 years since the end of the Civil War, and we might not just be people wanting big things, we might also be people dealing with different dynamics at the same time and not knowing how to address the changes that are coming through. And also, I just want, actually I'll leave it
All right. Thank you. So, what about the capacity, the know-how? Is it?
They might just not know how to deal with it.
Yeah, but they just don't know how to do it. Okay. Who would like to start? Ricardo, you want to respond?
I'll just take the first question about the shanty towns. I think it was implicit in what we all said, that there's a great sense of frustration, there's a great yearning, because the per capita endowment of oil in Angola is relatively high. There's enough money not to turn Angola into Switzerland overnight, but to give a more dignified, better life condition to many Angolans. And the government has not, over the last 13 years, tried
Social
to
infrastructure.
minimize those expectations. They've sort of built that up. So now, which I think it would, just to seg into Lillian's question, it would be very unfair to judge the Angolan trajectory after 2002 according to overly demanding expectations. We need to understand Angolan's tragic history. We need to understand what the capabilities are at the ground level. But the set is staged by the state itself when it phrases itself as what I call an hyper-developmentalist successful state. There's been very little modesty in the state's promises to the population. And in that regard, it's only, for instance, I'll give you an example that is infamous in Angola. The president in 2008 promised 1 million houses by 2012, which in modern Western state would have difficulties in delivering. And yet a lot of Angolans did believe those promises. So you can imagine when, for any number of reasons, including the 2009-2010 economic crisis, that promise was not actually fulfilled, you can imagine what frustration this has. But I think what the question you asked is really the key political question, particularly urban youth, what they will do and how they will perceive this dashing of their expectations. That will be the great political question for the coming decade. The other question in regard to...
I just wanted to say, I think that one of the most extraordinary things about the Mosaic, the slum area, is actually the situation is, I think that the living conditions for people in the Mosaic, in my experience, has actually got worse, hasn't it, since the end of the war. I mean, in terms of kind of flooding, and this is perhaps partly to do with the environment, very heavy rains. I had a friend to stay recently for Christmas, and he showed me pictures in his house that I had taken years ago. Literally, they have a lot of people living in those areas now. They built inner brick walls inside their sort of sand breeze block houses. They built another brick wall so that they have to climb over the brick wall to get in and out of their houses through the door because the water comes up 2 feet. I mean, you see people walking. It's one of the great things of Facebook, actually. You see people walking around up to their waist in water. This is, I mean, people Angola people here have family and friends, and they know better than me, but I mean, the people I know there, I think the water's getting higher. It's really shocking. It's really
Oligarchies are enjoying. Oligarchies. We don't want Dubai type pattern.
The other two questions, the question about the money. This was a value, $467 billion was a value published by Professor Alves da Rocha in Expansão last weekend. And he calculated that simply by adding the amounts of the national, this is official data, the amounts of the national budget that have accrued since 2003 from the oil sector, which is a vast, vast amount of public revenues. Because in Angola, non-oil taxation is practically non-existent, except for some more recent revenues from the port system. Most of the money comes from the oil sector. Now, the question you asked is about payments. In other words, what happens, how do the Angolans pay the Chinese? And the way the official relationship through China's Exim Bank works, but also through CIF, which is the whole different issue, works, is through essentially the payment is in cargoes. It's not paid in money. There's safety payment structures, what's called special purpose vehicles, and the payment goes in the form of oil cargoes that go to China instead of the Chinese being dependent on individual cash payments of the Angolan government, which gives the Chinese huge, very safe repayment structures, which actually is an inheritance. People thought the Chinese model was something completely innovative, but that's how the Angolan government paid for the war in the 1990s and beyond. Because people wouldn't trust them to fork out the money, they would create these mechanisms that were safe repayment structures. Again, a deep amount of, a serious amount of continuity with wartime methodologies. The other point that I was asked by Lillian about capacity. Look, again, this you have to look at the difference between rhetoric and reality. What you have in Angola is officially a major commitment to education, to higher education. Just to give you an example, as I mentioned, I think I quote, this is from the National Strategy of Development. In 2008, there were about 50,000 Angolans with university education. By 2012, there were 150,000 Angolans in university education, and now there's about 200,000. So the quantitative commitment sounds impressive. The reality is absolutely atrocious. Most Angolan universities, with the exception of 2 or 3, frankly, are corruption-ridden to an extent that no one even bothers to actually go to university or study for exams. Serious people who go through these universities and pay a huge amount of money to get a university degree then get discriminated against because guess what? Angolan corporations don't trust them. Senegal only hires Angolans from 3 Angolan universities. They throw away the CVs from all the other universities. This is Senegal, right? The private sector in Angola wants to hire Angolans who come with university degrees from Portugal, from Brazil, from the United States, from Britain. In other words, they talk the talk, but the actual qualitative investment in Angolan social capabilities has been very limited.
Tell me the story you told me.
Which poster?
I was with Ricardo the other night and he told me a story about in one university in Luanda.
Yes, I'll give you another university. I won't mention out of respect because I have serious professionals and students who are at this university, because it's not that everyone that comes out of these universities is bad, but it soils the brand and then you can't get a decent job. University in central Luanda, in Angola you have to do an end-of-degree thesis or a special paper. You actually have an advertisement in the yard of the university advertising private company that sells end-of-degree thesis to students, anywhere between $3,000 and $4,000, which is a lot of money anywhere in the world. But guess what? One of the owners of that company is one of the people who are important at the university management. It's as scandalous as that, which really belittles the serious effort that individual Angolans are making. People are making, I know stories of people who are making huge sacrifices for one person in their families to be able to go to university. And then, what happens when they get into the job market? They either don't get a job, or they get a very junior job because there's an expat from Brazil, or from Portugal, or from China, or from anywhere that has the job. And guess what? Oftentimes the expats do have the skills that the local Angolan didn't get, because, you know, the best, Angola now has thousands of great human resources, but they're mostly snapped up by the oil companies and by a few international players. But there's still a serious dearth of human resources, and unfortunately the investment is not there yet. Okay?
Let's have some more questions. Yes.
I'll be briefer in my answers so that we can.
Yes. Yeah, gentleman behind you, yes.
James Mann.
Yeah.
Ricardo, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the succession. You talked about this inner oligarchy. How dynastic is it? In other words, are you talking about an expectation of a kind of struggle between individuals, or are we talking about families who put in that dynasty? And I link that to the other questions which have been about this huge gap between this tiny oligarchy and the fate of ordinary people. Can one identify within this oligarchy a kind of Peronist candidate? Someone who might break ranks by appealing over the head of all of this modernist consumerism. No doubt with his own agenda to pay the populist card.
James, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I just want to ask you a bit about Angola's relationship with its neighbours, particularly South Africa, whether how that works. Because you haven't mentioned, you talked about Brazil, Cuba, Portugal, but South Africa is another big player in the area.
Yeah. And right at the back.
Yeah, hi. You talked about kind of Angolan politics and deinstitutionalizing. I remember I read one of your working papers about comparing Sudan, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Angola. And one of the theses of that is that these countries all have very kind of ideologically coherent armies and military structures. So to what extent is that still true in Angola? To what extent is the military as an institution still something to pay attention to, and what role will it play in any kind of succession conflict?
Three very straightforward questions. Dynasty, is there a dynasty? Is there a Peron going to emerge from this? The role of the military, and also what's the relationship with the neighbours?
I didn't plan these questions, but they're really useful in sort of fleshing out some things. The first one about succession. It's important to understand that the history of the MPLA, the ruling party in Angola, is very vociferous and very violent. In fact, Lara wrote an extraordinary book about the Nito Alves failed coup in 1977, which supposedly the Russians encouraged but the Cubans foiled. It's one of those internal sort of leftist stories of the Cold War that are still not fully told. And there's been a fair amount of murder and mayhem in the early life of the party. But since the coming to power in 1979 of President dos Santos, he's had a very stabilizing effect inside the party. He's taken bloodletting out of the picture. So no one has been killed inside the MPLA since 1979. And especially from the early 1990s, it's created a very predictable arrangement whereby everyone in the system who's important gets fed. In other words, even if you're politically marginalized, as was, for instance, Lopo Nascimento, who's one of the most senior people in the MPLA at a certain point, you wouldn't sort of actually suffer the fate that you would have had suffered under Savimbi. In other words, Savimbi, UNITA's leader, would have had you killed. I always like the example of João de Matos, who was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces in the 90s, who essentially won the war for dos Santos. Dos Santos let him go just immediately before the end of the war so that João de Matos wouldn't reap the rewards of being the war hero. Well, what happened to João de Matos? He's one of the wealthiest men in the country, and he married Miss Angola. That's not such a bad way to go down. The way people, Savimbi treated people is a bit harsher. So he's been a pacifying influence. But all of that internal life of the MPLA, the different families, the rotten history, the racial and regional divides, the issue about the overrepresentation of whites and mestizos in some corners of the party, those are issues that have not disappeared. And they'll come back. Okay? That's a very, very important point. The second point about succession. Dos Santos would like to put his son, Zen, who's my age, 37. He's a smart guy. He's well-spoken, British educated, Westminster University, worked for Glencore for a while, I think. He's a smart guy. But the MPLA doesn't quite want that. So there's a tug of war inside the party around that, and a lot of other hypothetical candidates. The truth is that no one knows. But what you could say is that this is not Mexico's PRI. There is no, or the Chinese Communist Party, there's no orderly internal mechanism for the MPLA to generate a successor. And that's worrying in its own right.
Can I add something again that I got from you the other night? I just think is interesting. Other people, I sort of had a free.
My stories are all memorable.
They are. But you were talking about. I asked you the question about was the drop in oil price, might that open up a crack in terms of dos Santos's or that particular sort of set bubble of the MPLA around him? And as I understand it, your analysis is in fact that what's likely to happen, or what has happened, is that it's almost like the drop in oil price is seen as a kind of a common enemy. It's unified around dos Santos. It's unified them even more.
I certainly don't have any reason to think I may be wrong, and tomorrow there's a revolution, and you'll say, oh, but you know, so much for futurology. But I don't think that. I think it introduces unpredictability, introduces chaos. Friction, but we're not talking about regime change. And that takes me to the next point, which I found very interesting in talking to people in the opposition. I won't say any names, but people in the main opposition parties, not just UNITA. And sooner or later, people would blurt out that the relevant politics for the immediate future of the country are internal MPLA politics. You know, the opposition is underfunded. It's not as incoherent and it's not as much on the defenses as it was 4 or 5 years ago. But the disparity in power and resources and sophistication between the established parties and the MPLA is very considerable. So even people in the opposition, they're asking questions about what's going on inside. About the MPLA, we have some inkling, and we certainly know that most people don't want them to come in. But there's a whole amount of speculation. But if you want to look at the real black box in Angolan politics, it's the armed forces. The armed forces are the largest armed forces in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, at this stage. They never demobilize. About 120,000 men. There's sort of not very efficient Navy as well, but there is a fairly efficient Air Force. There's a paramilitary police that is very, very significant and very important for the defense of the regime, the Ninjas, the Polícia de Defesa Rápida. But especially inside the armed forces, Dos Santos has kept them on his side by keeping them rich and happy. There's a huge procurement budget that gets used to buy drones and stuff like that don't really get used unless the enemy's the opponent. But the extent to which the armed forces are going to remain politically quiet and essentially remain a non-actor in Angolan politics, I say watch that space. I'm not saying they will act politically, and over the last decade they've been completely sort of hemmed in and disempowered by the particular pattern of Dos Santos' oversight of the armed forces, because he's the commander-in-chief constitutionally. But we don't know what's going to happen next. And finally, the question about South Africa. South Africa is very interesting. Friends of ours, who Lara will also have interviewed, who were in prison in 77, 78, 79, they remember these leftists that were sort of mocked up and put in jail by the MPLA in the aftermath of this coup. They remember finding ANC dissidents that were dropped into Angolan prisons to be made to disappear by the ANC at certain moments in time. And very similar dynamic to the dynamic of SWAPO in the camps around Obama, as we all know. So there's a long and heavy history of the ANC in Angola, which wasn't seized upon by Mbeki, because there was a deep personal antipathy between Mbeki and the Angolans, perhaps because Mbeki's time in Angola in the 80s was not so nice. But that kicked into life with Zuma. In fact, if I remember correctly, Zuma's first trip abroad was to Luanda. And a pattern of business, including involving families, I'm told, of the respective heads of state, has made the relationship much sturdier, much more intimate. And in Angola, for the first time ever in my experience, South Africa is not reflexively seen as an enemy/adversary. When push comes to shove, for instance, when it comes to the matter of regional integration through SADC, through the regional organization, every time the South Africans suggest bringing down tariffs or somehow creating a bit of economic space, the Angolans recoil because they don't want to see South Africa's sort of power expand in the region. The Angolans, in fact, to their own high cost, have preferred to remain import dependent on Brazil, Portugal, and China, and to actually create a relationship that is economically more rational, but politically complicated for one, which would be to have open borders or more open borders with South Africa and the region as a whole. But that's, I agree with the question, it's a very important regional dynamic. And as you see a pattern of South Africa and Angola collaborating at the AU level, I think it's important to see where the relationship is going. Okay. 3